Welcome back to What Makes You Tick. I'm Stephen Bradshaw, and the reason I created this podcast is to help you find inspiration from the stories and experiences of others. What Makes You Tick is a vehicle for people to share their life's knowledge, their passions, and experiences with you. I get energy and inspiration from talking to people, and my goal through this platform is to help you learn from others and use this knowledge to inform your lives.
She knew the price. She knew that she would be alienated, which she was for years. But I think she felt like I'm not just doing it for my, in some ways I'm doing it to support myself, my family, but also for the daughter that's not even born yet. Because I know that, this is a generational change, but she's really paying the price for that.
Born and raised in Washington, D.C., Ellie Walton is passionate about honoring and sharing stories of everyday revolutions. In this episode, Ellie shares some key moments in her life that set her on a path of curiosity, exploration, and adventure. I was introduced to Ellie by a former guest of mine, Tina Kothari, and it was here where I found and learned about Ellie's documentary, Brave Girls. This hour-long documentary was shot over 4 years and explores the day in the life of young women in India who are bound to Indian norms and tradition of arranged marriages. It is through the documentary we see how brave these girls really are to go against their tradition, to extradite themselves from their community in order to follow their hearts and desires for further education. Ellie describes the experience, shares some behind-the-scenes moments with me, and exudes passion for life and the freedom of storytelling. Ellie's bright lust for life is unquestionable, and it is through empathy and having a curious mindset that she's able to bring to the screen a world we may never have known otherwise. Ladies and gentlemen, this is my discussion with Ellie Walton. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to What Makes You Tick, and my guest today is a fascinating lady. She is a director, but her story is incredible because it kind of shares, I suppose, an insight into people's lives that we wouldn't necessarily hear or see on our everyday, and it kind of gives people an opportunity to reflect and to see, I suppose, how grateful we are in our own lives, and also then to, I suppose, acknowledge that there's others out there who are fighting still and constantly fighting through struggles. My guest is director and fascinating lady, Ellie Walton. Welcome. How are you?
Doing well. Thank you so much for having me. A real joy to be here.
And we have, I suppose, a luxury that we're recording on Paddy's Day. So happy Paddy's Day to everybody out there. When you hear this, I'll be sipping away on my pint of Guinness, and Ellie has a nice sneaky little whiskey in the background there as well. So it's all good. We have to keep it Irish, But Ellie, welcome along. How's life been going? You good?
Yeah, all doing good. Yeah, I got vaccinated on Friday.
Oh, did you? Great.
Yeah. I'm filming that next week, hanging with my kiddos, seeing
Things
the
are
light,
good. Life
feels
is good.
good. Life is
Yeah,
good.
happy days. We're slow on the list on the vaccinations, all right. But my sister's over in Philly, and she got vaccinated yesterday as well. So, and her husband. So, I think you guys are moving a lot quicker than we are.
Yeah,
Ireland doesn't know what's happening.
Well, it's a collective, right? Like
Yeah.
I was feeling like I get it, but this is for everybody, right?
Yeah.
So the more people, wherever you are, this
Yeah.
is a collective effort to not
Exactly.
spread, so.
Exactly. Well, Ellie, let me start, and I think it'd be good to give people a bit of context on who you are. You grew up in Washington. What was it like growing up in Washington? Because your childhood was a little bit, I suppose, different to the norm, or what would be expected, right?
Yeah. So I grew up. I grew up in a neighborhood called Mount Pleasant in Washington, D.C. And, I grew up in the 80s, 90s, not to give away my age, but
A young one. Don't worry about it.
It was very much a Latino barrio, and I grew up, my mom was an artist on a street full of people who hung out on their porches. And I feel like, the neighborhood really raised me, and
Yeah.
I grew up kind of with this just this feeling that that community was there to take care of each other, look out for each other. You walk down the street. I like, me and my brother just ran up and down, played with everyone, danced at block parties, before we knew each other and we looked out for each other.
Okay.
Um, and that's something that has really, stuck with me in terms of like that real value of community.
Lovely.
Um, and yeah, so that was, it's a beautiful thing.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because like community is such a big thing, I think, here in Ireland as well. And like we kind of say in Ireland that like Ireland is like a village, right? Everybody knows everybody. And one of the things that I've heard when people go to the States is that there's an element of anonymity, that people can do what they want, say what they want, even tell stories how they want, and they'll never be checked or judged or anything like that, because there's nobody to kind of catch them out, for want of a word. But the fact that you grew up in a community, I think, is really interesting, because that, I suppose, community aspect of things, like you're close to your family, and I suppose, is there a kind of link to how you found a way into pursuing a career of being a director, a film director? Is there a kind of a link there?
Totally. And actually, I mean, there's so many seeds that get planted in you along the way. And like no life is A to B. Like my life has not been straight, and in each turn I've made, there have been different folks that have inspired me. But looking back to growing up and really like the initial I guess incident or moment that really set me on my path was actually when the kind of floor was sort of like kind of shaken, kind of like the carpet was sort of taken from me. And that actually is what I'm making a film about now. And it's about I was 9 years old and a young man in my neighborhood was shot by a police officer. And I remember walking up and seeing him being taken away, and then seeing my neighborhood be surrounded by police, and all of a sudden we were under attack because it unleashed an uprising against the shooting, and yet it was us that were seen as being to blame. And I think this memory of running to the roof to escape tear gas and just feeling like this ain't right. And all of a sudden, um, this community that raised me was under attack. And it was a realization of like the real injustice in the city that I grew up in that I had been kind of unaware of, as a 9-year old, as a white girl. And I think, that just initially was like set me on a journey to like, how can I be part of movements, conversations, art that can allow people to really see one another and listen to one another.
Lovely, yeah, because isn't it hard to, I suppose, in a crowded area and space to get your voice out there, right? And I suppose the fact that you guys were in a community and yet you were shouting, but nobody was hearing you or nobody was listening to you. There's other ways to tell the stories, right?
Mhm.
Because one of the areas that I think, and I think it's part of your story as well, is was it your sister and yourself were out, and you guys were basically fed up at the time, I suppose, of the LGBT community were getting kind of downtrodden and they weren't being given a voice, and you were young at this stage as well, so
Yeah.
you shot your very, very first ever documentary or docu-movie called Lesbian Avengers, right?
Yeah.
Which I think is brilliant. And if anybody wants to check it out, head to Ellie's website, elliewalton.com, and you'll get to see it for yourself. And young Ellie being interviewed and the whole lot. But could you maybe describe that moment? Because that was kind of like nearly a shift in your own trajectory, right?
For sure. Because like I said, I was 9 years old on my rooftop, like recognizing that like things weren't right, like this is wrong what's happening. But I didn't know what to do about that. And I think, when my sister, she's 10 years older than me, and she's an artist and just an incredible human being and just inspired me so much. So when like 2 years later, I was 11, I'd actually changed my name to Jupiter.
Oh,
And
wow.
yeah, all my teachers would be like, Ellie, Ellie. I'd be like, no, that's not my name. I'm not answering until you call me Jupiter. So I was starting to shift and get a
What?
little, I don't
Identity
know what I was
change
doing.
at 11. Go on.
But so she was influencing me a lot. She's pretty radical, and she was part of a group called the Lesbian Avengers. And there was a roller skating rink where during couples time they had actually kicked some folks out who had been part of the Lesbian Avengers, because they were lesbians holding hands during couples time. And so as an act of civil disobedience, my sister organized with the Lesbian Avengers, to go there, and during couples time to everyone go onto the floor, holding hands, and and as we entered the roller rink, she handed me a camera. I'm 11 years old holding this camera, and I just remember that feeling, pressing record, capturing my sister be this like revolutionary on the roller rink. And then the police stormed in, and like continuing to roll as the police stormed in. But it didn't fully click for me till that night, because when the news team arrived, they asked us for the footage and we gave them the tape. And
Yeah.
so that night I saw this footage on our local TV station. And then that connection happened. It's like, oh wow, video, film, art in general has this capacity to kind of witness things that are happening in our world, and then spread it, so like there's like an honoring and a sharing, and that just felt like magical.
What was it like at 11 years old seeing that? As in you're there, and like at 11, it's hard to contemplate Jesus what goes on today, let alone the police storming into somewhere and kind of creating a bit of havoc, right? What was it? How did you feel?
Yeah, well, I think in some ways, young folks, and when I was a kid, you have such a clear sense of right and wrong. Like it's not muddied yet, you're not like seeing necessarily all the multiple layers. It's just like that is wrong. Like these folks have a right to be here and to love who they want to love and hold hands with who they want to hold hands with. And this is wrong. And so I think I remember feeling really angry, and it's such a visceral feeling as a kid.
Hmm.
And then also really proud of my sister. And I think that's something that really has stayed with me and has influenced my work, because I just looked up to how she was really pushing against the mold, and she had courage, to really go in there and put her life, and turn not her life, but like some folks got arrested that night. It's like, that sense of bravery, and that night we were all wearing t-shirts that said "Brave Girl," just honoring folks who were kind of standing up to the injustices that they were experiencing.
I think that's a beautiful link to another area that I want to talk to you about, obviously, because I my introduction to you, Ellie, was before I actually physically spoke to you or had a video conversation with you. Was I actually saw your work? It's it was brought to my attention by most wonderful lady, Tina Kothari, from an organization called Another Way Now. And Tina was a mentor to my sister when she was working in the UK, and is now a really good friend. And I've actually befriended Tina now as well. I'm I kind of jumping on the bandwagon there, but I had Tina on as a guest earlier on the What Makes You Tick podcast, and she spoke to me about Brave Girls. And it's interesting that you had, when you shot your first ever documentary, which was Lesbian Avengers, you guys were holding these placards saying "Brave Girl" and wearing these T-shirts and so on. And this movie that I got to see was called Brave Girls, but it was very different to what was happening in Washington, but also quite similar in a way, right? So it was a documentary about these incredible girls who are fighting against, I suppose, a traditional norm. And I got to see that and I was blown away. And I said to Tina, any chance you could make an introduction? And she did. And here we are now. And I'd love if you wouldn't mind maybe just giving our listeners a summary or synopsis of what that story is about. And yeah, in your own words.
Yeah. Wow. So so Brave Girls, which is a film co-directed with my dear friend Yashasui, um, and it follows three young women over the course, of 4 years we filmed with them, and really showing them coming of age on their own terms. So fighting for the right to go back to school, to stay in school, to live a life of their choosing. Um, and the film captures them as they make an almost impossible decision between school and their community by breaking from their arranged marriages so that they continue their education. So it's a film which is honoring their courage, to really recreate and reimagine the traditions that they live.
Yeah, like it's phenomenal. Like set in Dholka, is it in
Mm,
India?
yeah.
And what I found fascinating was, I suppose, Ireland is very much a kind of like has been a very much a traditional country run by religion, right, and run by Catholicism. And back in the day, like when my parents and my grandparents were growing up, it was like it was the pillar of the community, right? Ireland, as I've been growing up and as I've kind of, I suppose, evolved into a man and stuff, we've become far more liberal and far more open and far more accepting of different things. Like, so we were the first country in Europe to um, um, go for a gay marriage, right? We were the first
Mhm.
country in we've invited into the abortion law, has made that acceptable now. So there's been a lot of really progressive things happening. And
Mhm.
what I took from Brave Girls is that these girls are fighting against tradition and against the way it always has been, which isn't necessarily the way it always should be, right?
Mhm.
And what was it like for you going into this world from a Western kind of background into a completely different environment?
Well, what was interesting is that, like in some ways, just thinking about, I'm gonna answer your question, but I'm gonna back up a little bit to the idea of like of tradition, right?
Yeah.
Because I think something that I learned making the film was that actually tradition isn't necessarily this thing that's like weighing on our shoulders from like our ancestors and we have to follow it, that it's like it's alive and it's constantly moving, and it can move because we are it, like we are tradition, we are like we create it by through the rituals and how we interact with one another. And I think and like with that recognition, like even for these young women, like there were moments where their moms even shared, like, I've been so scared of community and what they'll think. But then they said that I am that community, and I wait, I am part of this, and let's create something that's healthy for us, and how can we reimagine it?
Yeah.
So in that sense, like I kind of walked into a space um that didn't necessarily feel like um necessarily that different where I grew up, right? I
Okay.
think,
Great. Yeah.
at the end of the day, they really looked out for one another. Like going back to growing up in Mount Pleasant, like everyone knew each other. You walked into someone's home and they immediately gave you chai and water, and we talked about family. And there was, I think, this curiosity that went both ways. Like they were so curious about who I was and how I grew up, and just as much as I was curious about what was driving them and their dreams were. So I think that like entering that space, um, really open, um, like it didn't, I didn't feel so outside or different, but obviously I was. And I
Yeah.
and I think, I was there with Yesha Suisse, which is interesting. She grew up a couple hours away.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, and she
so
hopefully she'll be a guest on the show as well to share her
yeah.
story. But like that's the thing is like, it, remember this documentary, while it's is it 2 hours? An hour and a
No,
half?
just over an hour, just over an
Just
hour.
over an hour, right?
Yeah.
So, but while it's over an hour, that's 4 years compressed into 1 hour, right? Which is a skill in itself. Because I've worked in shoots and all that stuff, and I know how long it takes, and like when you're flying the wall stuff, then it's a different story, right? But like that's shot over 4 years into 1 hour, and you tell the story incredibly well. But where did the idea come from? Like, what was the
Mm.
how did it become right? We're going to do this.
Yeah, well, that's interesting because, there's an amazing director that I love at Cartemquin Films, Steve James and Gordon Quinn. They did Hoop Dreams, and they always said the best films don't come from good ideas. They come from situations, comes from like life happening, unfolding. And I feel like, for me, there's never a moment before one of my films where I like sit down and like, let me think of something that's really cool. Like, I'm gonna write a plan, like I don't do any of that. Actually, I am so bad at planning. Like, don't sit me in front of a chessboard. I can't think strategically. Like, but I think how I live my life is very open to things unfolding. So it's like the first law of improv is yes and, so if
Yes.
someone comes to me with something, it's sort of opening my arms, yes, and what can we do with that? So to go back to your question, I was actually sitting in London because I went to film school in London at Goldsmiths, and I was working with young offenders, giving cameras to young people to capture their story of what it was like living inside. And and we created pieces, and a woman from India who was part of a program that was sending girls back to school, she came over and saw what I was doing and said, we want to do this in India. We would love for you to come facilitate workshops with our young women, so that they can create their stories. And that was really the seed. And so I landed in India, met Yashasvi on, in the first week. I didn't know her before then,
No
but
way.
I knew I couldn't do it alone. Um, and we just immediately connected, and we landed in Dolca with a backpack full of donated cameras, and no script or plan. The only thing we wanted to do was create a space for these young women to share, to dream, to play, to use the cameras to capture their journey back to school. So that was the beginning.
Wow. Wow. Like you would never think that while you're watching it, you would think that it was very well kind of coordinated and choreographed and stuff, because while it's lovely fly on the wall documentary type of thing, it's the girls are so honest, and they're so like giving to what it is they're trying to achieve. And for anybody that's listening, one of the things that stood out to me most was that in tradition with girls growing up in India, they are wedded, so they have arranged marriages, and with those arranged marriages, sometimes they work out and turn into love, and sometimes they don't. But the girl doesn't have a say, right? And in that journey, what we're seeing here is these girls want to have a say in their future. They want to have a say in the world love, and they want to have a say in their education and how they're educated and what choices they make for their lives. And I thought that was so powerful because it's easy for everybody to just go with the flow. I always say people are like sheep, right? We will get one sheep through the gate, the rest of them will flow, and people are the exact same, right?
Mm,
However, you get that one sheep that decides not to do the norm, and then it causes consternation, but it creates bravery in others.
mm.
Could you maybe discuss and tell us just a little bit about this girl, Asfana?
Yeah. Yeah. And I would say from the beginning, there was this spark in her, um, that was really just inspiring and amazing, to be around and to capture, because I think it was, the second day of doing workshops before we'd even shifted into capturing the documentary. And we asked her and Karishma, I mean, they could ask each other whatever question. And we didn't give any sort of examples. We are like, whatever is on your heart, on your heart and your mind, just ask, and she said, do you believe in love marriage? Do you believe in arranged marriage? Like, she's just like came out with it into this space. And and then Karishma responded, of course, I want the ability to choose. And Apsana, um, said, how can, to another girl who said, but we should follow what our families say. She said, how can we give up on our dreams? And, from that point on, Yashasvi and I realized there was this deeper story unfolding. And what was incredible about Apsana is that, for her, she deeply, deeply wanted to be able to support her family. Like, it can seem like this really selfish decision that she made, to run away from this marriage so that she can continue to go back to school, because the husband that she was promised to was going to make her leave. And so she fell backed into a corner, but because she really wanted to get a job and earn a living so that she could support her mom, like she's really thinking, she's not just thinking about herself in that moment. Like, she wants the right to choose, but she's doing it for her community, for her sisters, and to see that conviction in her, even though she knew the price, she knew that she would be alienated, which she was for years. But I think she felt like I'm not just doing it for my, in some ways I'm doing it to support myself, my family, but also for the daughter that's not even born yet. Because I know that, if we, this is a generational change, but she's really paying the price for that.
Yeah, she is. And she's kind of like she's creating history, right? And like you ever hear the butterfly effect? Like a butterfly's wing can cause a tornado around the world, right? Or something like that. Anyway, but essentially, what she's doing is that she's kind of paving the way. The more Asfanas there are in her community and in her traditional kind of growing up and environment, the more adjustments will be made, the more opportunities will be created, the more people will want to hear their stories. And I just think it's really interesting that seeing Brave Girls for me is like, that's the moment of change, but probably we won't recognize that change in our generation. It'll be the generations next that will realize that change. Do you get me? Do you think that too?
Yeah, I think so. It's so hard, and I'm sure Yashasvi will have deeper insights on this living there. But I mean, on the one hand, I feel like India is a really huge country, and things are probably pretty different in cities than in rural areas. And you're seeing those shifts already happening in the cities. But I do feel, having spoken a lot with Afsana, and she's been able to share this film and have conversations with other girls, and that's been a huge thing, because it's like, it's not just her story, but then it becomes this tool for conversations and for things sparking, and so many spaces they're sharing this, and people connect and like relate, like, wait, that's me, I feel trapped, maybe I could do that. So who knows, maybe it could happen sooner. But I do know that you're right in that, she is, committed to really honoring her daughter's dreams. It's actually the last line of the film, which maybe I shouldn't give away, but it's like,
Yeah, you're the director. It's your show.
Why not?
You say it. Say what you need to say.
But I just love it, because she's like, I have dreams for my daughter, but ultimately, I want to support her dreams. And it's like that subtle shift. And I know, as a parent, like, we all have these expectations, dreams for our kids, but in order to be like, no, I need to honor their path, and that's huge.
That's interesting you say that, because from that experience, have you kind of adjusted, or have you taken some of the learnings yourself to being a mom?
Well, I have two small boys who are 2 and 5-year-olds, and they are rebels.
Like the mother.
Yeah, but actually, it's good, because sometimes I'm like, oh my Lord, can we just like rein it in? Let's like follow some rules. And then I have to remember, like, wait 1 second, like, all about like the rule breakers. So maybe
Yeah, it might turned out okay, so it'll be
yeah,
fine. Yeah,
exactly.
jump in that puddle.
Yeah. Who needs shoes? Go, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, it'd be fine. Just to be one with be one with the ground, be one with the earth. The what advice would you give a I suppose let me phrase this a little bit differently. I worked with a university, all right, called Maynooth University here in Ireland, and they have a fascinating course in film studies and movies and stuff. And their lecturer, the kind of the dean of the whole thing, was um, always found that when it came to say role plays, right, that people say that lady or women would naturally fall into the producer role, right, and men would naturally fall into the director role. And she always questioned it because it wasn't because of a skill set. It was essentially because of a kind of like a way something has been triggered in their mind to think that guys are directors, girls are producers, right? Now, what I love and I'm really enjoying at the moment is obviously speaking to you, but watching even there was a documentary on those lads in New York. It's on Netflix at the moment, but it was about these kids who were put away for a crime they didn't commit, but it was directed by this amazing African-American female, right? I can't think of her name. But what I'm loving is that you're getting to see so many incredibly talented female producers or directors coming to the fore, right? And what this lecturer used to say was, why are you falling into that role naturally? You have the skill set to be a director, so you're the director, you know? So my question is, what was it like working as a female director in a predominantly male world, you know?
Yeah, well, as you might imagine, I kind of sidestepped in some ways the industry, but I, I was like,
Rule breaker,
they
love it.
aren't recognized. I'm just gonna create my own path over here. But that's what I still experienced it, and I have a lot of friends who really decided um, to climb the ladder in the industry. So at a TV channel, at a production company, and really struggled because they were often pigeonholed as AP, as a associate producer, as a production assistant, as a producer, which is like, again, it's like it is a gender stereotype that women are good at organizing and supporting and I and they found it really hard, especially friends of mine who are filmmakers of color. That's even a whole other,
Yeah.
level of, dealing with that oppression and not being seen and heard. But I think that is one path, and you can still carve your way through that. And this one friend I'm thinking about is now directing. So she made it through, and it was a struggle. I think for just speaking personally, I think from the get, I knew I didn't want to climb a ladder. I think the style of filmmaking and my process of filmmaking, which is really about same as, how Brave Girls started. It's like partnering with communities to co-create stories and maintaining their ownership of those stories. I think some of that is now happening more so in the mainstream, but when I started 15 years ago, that was really just not recognized as the process, because it takes a long time,
Yeah.
and in some ways, like, people think that you need to have a sense of distance and objectivity. And I'm not a journalist, I'm a filmmaker. Like, I want to co-create, and what I value most is authenticity and dignity. And I feel like that really gets strengthened when you're in a process of co-creation with the community. So all that to say, like, I think, I've definitely had my fair share of being hired on shoots because I get hired as a cinematographer and dealing with some of the dudes on set. I'm small too, so I think there's this like, how do you get the camera up there? It's like, well, I raise my arms. Like,
Thank you for listening to part 1. Ellie's energy is unquestionable and her passion is just bursting through. Part 2 is coming up, and if you want to know more, head to whatmakesyoutick.net.